Here is the score manager. Score manager is set up as a singleton. It is able to be accessed by factories for getting score commands. For example, Flea Factory. Here it initializes pdeath by getting the score manager to get score command for the flea being killed, and it passes that to the flea. So when the flea is initialized, it can now use this command. It can now send that command back when it is killed. So for example, here the flea is colliding with a bullet, so it calls the score manager to send the command for pdeath. Right. So when that happens, this pushes the command to the queue, and then score manager is processing scores every frame. Something externally calls score manager, which here is the game controller's external game object that an update calls the score manager to process the scores. And then what that does is that runs through the queue of score commands and executes each one. That can be a score by distance, which will calculate the math for spider and create the necessary spider explosion, as well as adding the score to the player score. Or it can be a score by value command, which simply adds the score. And that all that does is that creates a new score, and then that's just what the current score plus this new value is. And then the player manager simply sets that score to its current player. And then obviously the HUD display has to update that score. So the HUD display displays that new score. This changes the sprite string that is displayed up top with that new score. And so when the Flea Factory creates this is the only place where this command is created, because Flea Factory will last the entire program. So this is where it's created, and then at the end of the program, game manager closes in game end, game manager closes in game end, and that causes Flea Factory to clear the active fleas and delete that pdeath pointer. So it's going to delete that command along with the game controller being deleted. And so this score being updated means that the HUD display now needs to manage displaying that score. And so you saw this function getting called. No, this function getting called, displaying the high score with the int being the score which it needs to display. And this calls that sprite string high score display to change its value. And so once it does that, this car list is updated, and sprite string needs to do nothing else, because the HUD display will draw that sprite string down here. The HUD score display will draw, and that will simply go through its car list and draw each of the glyphs. And so when it comes to attractor mode, we create when it comes to the high score input, at the end of the level, when the player gets a new high score, this is mostly managed by the score manager. The score manager is able to call, for example, get high score list, which will return the high score manager pointer, And that high score manager right here has all of the list of the high scores. This high score manager owns this standard list of high score pointers, and these high scores consist of the score and the initials, as well as the sprite string which they need to display. So looking back in high score manager, it can either insert a score into the list, it can display the high score list, and it can either draw the high score or add the high score. So right here in display high score list, this is simply setting the sprite string of each of the high scores on that list and drawing them onto the screen. And so, as established before, this needs to be accompanied with blocking mushrooms, because blocking text is done by the mushroom field. So whenever this happens, this calls set string, set display is called on each of the array members of the high score list. But set display calls set string on the sprite string that high score has. So that set string displays blocking mushrooms in the positions behind the glyphs. So when the bullet shoots it, it will hit that glyph and it will hit that blocking mushroom. Alternatively, whenever high score input is created, this means that right here, high score input on initialize will create new sprite strings with the text to enter initials and also the actual characters that are going to be changed. And so when high score input is in progress, it checks for key presses. When it's the right arrow, when the player presses the right arrow, we add the cell index +1, meaning that this cell index corresponds to a value from 17 to 42, meaning a value from the empty character to all the way to Z, so from A to Z basically. And each time we press right on the keyboard, that value increments. And so this high score input display is updated to set car, which means that now it's setting a character to display, which is +1 of the value of the one that was displayed. So if it was A, then it would be B. And the reverse happens for when the player presses left. The cell index is subtracted. If that cell index is less than 17, or 16, which is the blank space, then it will simply go back to the letter Z. And so this sets that character again. When the player presses enter, then we know to save that character within a list. So current initials is that array of strings, or maybe of characters rather. So it adds the character that was already displayed into that array right here. And if the string index is too high, then we want to call the game controller input screen finish to basically finish that sequence and move on to whatever is next, maybe the second player, or maybe the end of the game and going back to attractor mode. But however, if the string index is not high enough, meaning there are still characters that the player can change in the initial input screen, then Here we set the string index plus equal to 1 because we're now changing a character that's to the right of the character we were just looking at. And so this sets the cell index to the letter A value, and so that displays the letter A, and this moves on. And if the player hits backspace, if the string index is not 1, because if it's 1, then that's the first character. If the string index is not 1, or I should say, if the string index is 1, then that's the second character, and it can go back. So it must be at least 1. So here, string index is subtracted, and cell index is just put to the previous cell index, and then the previous cell index here, it's updated whenever we set a character. So whenever you press enter, previous cell index is updated with the character that was already displayed with the character that we locked in. So when the player hits backspace, the cell index should become whatever character was in that space, so it is able to be changed to the next one or the previous one. And then this is just drawing the high score input. That's done by the HUD display. And so that is how the high score input works.